Dad's silent revenge.
I was sitting in my lawyer's office last Tuesday, sliding a folder full of evidence across his mahogany desk, when he looked up at me and said, "Harold, this is criminal fraud. We need to call the police." That's when I knew my plan had worked, but let me back up and tell you how I got there. My name is Harold Mitchell, and I'm 57 years old. 2 years ago, I made what might have been the smartest decision of my life. When I remarried, I didn't tell my new wife, Carol, or her 29-year-old son, Glenn, that I owned 8 rental properties across San Diego worth about $8 million. That decision saved everything you had spent 35 years building. I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood in Cleveland, son of a factory worker and a seamstress. Money was tight. Real tight. I watched my dad work double shifts just to keep the lights on, and I promised myself I'd never be that vulnerable. At 18, I joined the Navy. Spent 20 years traveling the world, learning about discipline and strategy. More importantly, I learned about the military housing allowance and how smart guys could turn it into real wealth. While my buddies were blowing their paychecks on cars and bar tabs, I was buying my first duplex near the naval base in Norfolk. Lived in one side, rented out the other. The military moved me around, but I kept that first property. Used the equity to buy another one in San Antonio when I got stationed there, then another in San Diego when they transferred me to Coronado. After my Navy service, I got into construction management. Good money, steady work, but the real money was in those rental properties. Every time the market dipped, I'd refinance and buy another house. Every time it went up, I'd use the equity for the next deal. By the time I met Carol, I had 8 properties generating about $18,000 a month in rental income after expenses. My first wife, Barbara, and I had 28 good years together. She knew about the properties, helped me manage them. We lived simply in our own house, saved the rental income, and watched our net worth grow. Then 3 years ago, Barbara had a heart attack, gone at 58. The grief nearly broke me. I'm not ashamed to say I cried every morning for 6 months. There were days I couldn't get out of bed, days I'd sit in the garage just staring at the tools we'd used together to fix up the rental properties. I'd find myself calling her phone number just to hear her voice on the voicemail. The house felt like a museum of our life together, every room echoing with memories I couldn't escape. I spent a year barely functioning. My daughter lives in Phoenix with her own family, called every week worried about me. She even flew out twice trying to get me to sell the house and move closer to her. But eventually, I started coming back to life, joined a veterans group at the VA, started going to the gym again, took a trip to Alaska with some Navy buddies who wouldn't take no for an answer. Slowly, very slowly, I remembered who I was before the grief consumed everything. That's when I met Carol Mitchell at a school fundraiser. She was an elementary school teacher, 54 years old, divorced for about 8 years. We started talking by the silent auction table about a fishing trip package, and 3 hours later, we were still talking in the parking lot because the event had ended and the janitors were locking up. Carol was warm, kind, she'd been teaching 30 years, loved kids, had that gentle way about her that teachers get. She told me about her divorce, how her ex-husband had been unreliable with money, how she'd raised her son Glenn mostly on her own after her husband walked out when Glenn was 12. I told her about Barbara, about the loneliness of coming home to an empty house, about learning to cook for one person after 3 decades of making dinner for 2. We started seeing each other slowly, dinners at quiet restaurants where we could talk. Walks on the beach at La Jolla where the sound of waves helped fill the comfortable silences. Weekend trips to wine country where we'd sit on vineyard patios and share stories about our first marriages, our kids, our fears about starting over in our 50s. It felt comfortable, safe, like finding shelter after being out in the cold too long. After 6 months, I asked if we could make it official. She said yes without hesitation, and I realized I hadn't felt that kind of certainty about anything since Barbara died. Carol lived in a modest 2-bedroom house in Claremont that she'd gotten in the divorce settlement. She told me she had her teacher's pension, some savings, owned her house outright, seemed financially stable, not wealthy, but comfortable. Smart with money in the careful way people are when they've been burned before. I lived in one of my rental properties, a 3-bedroom house in Mira Mesa with a view of the canyon. Carol knew I owned the house. What she didn't know was that I owned 7 others spread across San Diego County, from a duplex in Normal Heights to a 4-bedroom house near UCSD that I rented to graduate students. I didn't tell her because I'd learned something over the years. Money changes how people see you. And I wanted Carol to see me, Harold, not Harold the guy with a real estate portfolio. When people asked what I did, I said I was a retired construction manager who owned some rental property, which was true. I just didn't specify how much property. After a year of dating, I proposed simple proposal at Sunset Cliffs, watching the waves crash against the rocks. I said I didn't want to spend whatever years I had left alone. She said yes. and we both cried a little, understanding what it meant to find love twice in one lifetime. We decided on a small wedding. My daughter flew in from Phoenix. Carol's son Glenn came, of course. He lived with Carol, had been between jobs for about 2 years since getting laid off from a marketing company. He was polite enough, said he was happy for his mom, gave me a firm handshake and called me sir, but I should have paid more attention to the questions he asked at the wedding reception. So Harold, Mom mentioned you manage rental properties. How many units do you have in your portfolio? He asked casually over dinner, cutting into his chicken like we were discussing the weather. A few properties. Nothing too exciting, I said, focusing on my own plate. But how many exactly? I'm thinking about getting into real estate investing myself. Maybe you could give me some advice about financing, market analysis, that sort of thing. I kept it vague, changed the subject to his job search, asked what kind of work he was looking for. But I noticed how quickly head shifted from casual interest to business proposition. Red flag number 1, though I didn't want to admit it at my own wedding reception. The next encounter was about a month later. Glenn and Carol came to help me move some furniture from storage into the house. We were in my garage, and Glenn was looking around at my tools, my workbench, the organization system I'd built with pegboards and labeled bins. This is a nice house. Harold, what's a place like this worth now? About $750,000. He was running his hand along my table saw, examining the quality of the equipment. Around there, I said, not wanting to get into specifics about property values. Do you own it outright, or is there still a mortgage? Carol looked up from the box she was unpacking, surprised by the directness of the question. Glenn, that's personal. No, it's fine, Glenn said quickly, holding up his hands like he was surrendering. I'm just thinking from a financial planning perspective. You know, Mom, now that you're married, you and Harold should really think about estate planning, combining assets, tax optimization, that sort of thing. We've got wills, I said simply, hefting a box of Barbara's books that Id finally decided to unpack. But have you updated them since the marriage? Have you considered the tax implications of your rental properties? If they're held individually versus in a corporation or trust, the tax treatment is completely different. You could be losing thousands in unnecessary taxes. I had everything properly structured already through my accountant and lawyer, but I just said I have an accountant who handles all that. I'm sure they're competent, Glenn continued. But I've been researching real estate investment strategies online. There are new tax laws, new structures available. I could review everything. Maybe we could even partner on something. I have some ideas for expanding the portfolio, leveraging equity more efficiently. That was red flag number 2. The guy had been unemployed for 2 years living with his mother, but he wanted to partner with me on real estate deals and lecture me about tax optimization. Over the next few months, the questions kept coming. Always framed as helpful, always presented as family looking out for family. Glenn would send me articles about property investment via email, ask my opinion on market trends, probe for details about my holdings with the persistence of a detective. What neighborhoods do you think are best for rental yield? He'd ask at Sunday dinners while Carol was getting seconds. Have you considered refinancing in this rate environment? Interest rates are historically low, he'd say while we watched football during commercial breaks. What's your vacancy rate? Do you use property management software? How do you screen tenants? He'd ask while helping Carol with yard work, making conversation while we planted her new roses. The questions became more specific over time. How many units did I own exactly? What was my monthly cash flow after expenses? Did I have plans to expand the portfolio? What happened to the properties when I died? Who was my attorney? Had I considered setting up a family trust? That last question came up at Christmas dinner. We'd just finished the main course, and Carol was in the kitchen, getting dessert ready, humming along to the Christmas music playing softly in the background. Harold, I've been thinking about succession planning. Glenn said, leaning forward across the table. I mean, you've built something substantial. What happens to it when, well, eventually, I have a will, I said, watching his face carefully. But does it minimize the tax burden? Have you considered putting everything in a trust? That way, when you and Mom, well, in the future, there wouldn't be any probate issues, any complications. Why would there be complications? I asked quietly. Glenn backtracked quickly. I'm not saying there would be, I just think it's smart to plan these things properly. Blended families can get complicated if estate planning isn't structured right. I've been reading about it, blended families. That phrase stuck with me like a splinter, because suddenly I understood. Glenn wasn't asking out of curiosity or desire to help. He was calculating, wondering what his mother's new husband owned, and whether any of it would eventually come to Carol and through her to him. Carol came back with dessert, and I changed the subject to football, asked Glenn if he was following the Chargers this season. But later that night, after Glenn left for his evening shift at a warehouse job Head picked up, I told Carol what I was thinking. His just being practical, she said, loading the dishwasher with more force than necessary. He worries about me. After what his father put me through financially, Glenn doesn't want to see me get hurt again. Carol, his asking about my assets like Hez planning to inherit them. She got defensive, turning to face me with her arms crossed. Harold, that's my son. He's not some gold digger. His just concerned about our future, about making sure we're protected. That's when I realized the real problem. Carol couldn't see what I was seeing because she didn't want to. Glenn was her only child, and she'd been protecting him his whole life. After his father abandoned them, she'd been both mother and father, working extra hours to pay for his college, covering his car insurance when he couldn't find work, making excuses for his failures because admitting he had problems meant admitting she'd failed as a parent. Over the next 6 months, things escalated. Glenn started having financial emergencies. His car broke down, needed $3,000 for repairs. Then he had a business opportunity that required a $5,000 investment. Carol started dipping into her savings to help him. I tried talking to her about it, but she'd shut down. Hez going through a rough patch. His mother. What am I supposed to do? Let him struggle. There's helping and there's enabling, Carol. How many rough patches can one person have? You don't understand? You had your military career, steady income, benefits. Glenn's generation has it harder. The economy, student loans, competition for jobs. That's when I realized Glenn wasn't just probing about my assets. He was already working on Carol's. And if I didn't do something, he'd drain her savings and then start pushing for access to what he thought were our combined marital assets. So I decided to set a trap. I started leaving financial documents around where Glenn might see them, bank statements showing large deposits, real estate documents with impressive property values, but all fake. I created fictional properties, fictional income statements, fictional equity positions using my computer and printer. I wanted to see how far Glenn would go if he thought there was real money involved. The bait worked perfectly. Glenn started asking more aggressive questions. He suggested we form a family LLC to protect our assets and minimize tax liability. He offered to handle our bookkeeping for free. He even volunteered to help with property management, said he could learn the business from the ground up. Then, one day in March, Carol came to me upset, holding her phone with shaking hands. Harold, I think someone tried to access my bank account online. The bank called about suspicious activity. What kind of activity? Someone tried to transfer $15,000 to an account I don't recognize. They said the attempt was blocked because it exceeded my daily transfer limit and triggered their fraud protection. I felt my blood pressure spike. Did they say where the transfer request came from? My home computer? But Harold, I didn't make any transfer. I don't even know how to do wire transfers online. I knew exactly who had access to Carol's home computer and could have watched her enter her banking passwords. Glenn lived there. He used her computer regularly for job searches and what he called research. That's when I decided to stop playing defense and start gathering real evidence. I went to Best Buy and bought a small wireless security camera, the kind you can hide behind books on a shelf. Cost me $89. I also downloaded legitimate monitoring software for her computer that would track login attempts and keystrokes. I told Carol I was installing security updates and virus protection. Within a week, I had everything I needed. Video footage of Glenn using Carol's computer to access her bank account at 2 a.m. when she was asleep. Screenshots of him attempting transfers to accounts registered in his name. Records of him searching through her saved documents for financial information, including the fake documents ID planted. But I needed more. I needed to catch him in an actual crime, not just attempted theft, something that would hold up in court and convince Carol once and for all. So I set up the ultimate trap. I created a fake estate planning document using legal templates I found online and left it where Glenn would find it. The document showed that I was worth $12 million in real estate assets and that everything would go to Carol if I died. Then I had my lawyer call Carol to schedule a routine estate planning review and mentioned that I might be updating my will to include her as primary beneficiary. Glenn took the bait completely. Within 48 hours, he was pushing Carol to have that estate planning meeting as soon as possible. He volunteered to drive her to the appointment. He even suggested they stop by the bank first to update account information and beneficiary designations. That's when I called my lawyer, Steven Rodriguez, and told him what was really happening. We set up a meeting, but instead of an estate planning session, it was going to be a confrontation with evidence that could send Glenn to prison. The day of the meeting, I arrived early at Steven's office with 2 folders. One contained all the evidence of Glenn's attempted financial fraud organized chronologically with timestamps and documentation. The other contained my real estate portfolio documents proving I actually did have significant assets, just not in the fictional accounts Glenn had been targeting. Steven Rodriguez had been my attorney for 15 years, handled the legal work when I bought my properties. He was a straight shooter, former prosecutor who'd moved into private practice, specializing in estate planning and financial crimes. When Eid called him the week before and explained the situation, Head listened without interruption, then said, "Harold, if you got solid evidence, this is more than family drama. This is criminal fraud." When Carol and Glenn arrived at the law office, Glenn looked nervous but excited. He was wearing his best shirt and had actually gotten a haircut. He probably thought he was about to learn exactly how much money would eventually come his way, maybe even get named as some kind of beneficiary or trustee. Instead, Steven laid out the evidence methodically like he was presenting to a jury. The bank records showing attempted unauthorized transfers. The computer logs showing Glenn accessing his mother's accounts without permission at odd hours. The screenshots of him searching through private financial documents. The video footage of him using her computer while she slept. Carol went white, staring at the printouts like they were written in a foreign language. Glenn started making excuses immediately, claiming he was just trying to help organize her finances. "Mom, you're terrible with technology. I was just making sure your accounts were secure, checking for fraud. Identity theft is huge these days. Steven wasn't buying it. Mr. Mitchell, attempting to transfer $15,000 to an account in your name isn't checking for fraud. It's committing fraud." Glenn's face flushed red. "That was a mistake. I was trying to set up a savings account for Mom somewhere safe where she could put money aside for emergencies. Without her knowledge or permission at 2 a.m. to an account she had no access to." Steven's prosecutor voice was coming out. "That's not financial planning, son. That's theft. That's when I dropped the real bombshell. Glenn, you've been so interested in my assets. Let me show you what I actually own." I slid the second folder across the table. 8 rental properties worth about $8 million, all properly documented, all legally protected in trust structures, and none of it will ever be accessible to you. Glenn's jaw dropped. Carol stared at me like Id just told her I was secretly an astronaut. "Harold, you own $8 million in real estate?" "I do, and it's all structured so that if something happens to me, you're taken care of for life. But the properties themselves go to my daughter in Phoenix. Glenn can never touch any of it, contest it, or manipulate you into accessing it." Glenn exploded. "You've been lying to us this whole time. Playing some kind of sick game. I've been protecting what I built over 35 years from people who see dollar signs instead of family," I said calmly. And apparently I was right to do so. Steven took over from there, his voice professional but firm. "Mr. Mitchell, attempting to access someone else's bank account, even a family member's, constitutes financial fraud under California Penal Code 484E. Searching through private financial documents without permission violates privacy laws. Your behavior meets the legal definition of financial elder abuse under Welfare and Institutions Code 1561-3D. Glenn tried to backtrack, claiming he was just worried about his mother's financial security, that Head never intended to steal anything. But the evidence was too clear, too well documented. Steven had prosecuted cases with less evidence than what I'd gathered. The lawyer gave Glenn a choice: accept a formal restraining order preventing him from accessing Carol's finances, enter a court-supervised financial counseling program, pay full restitution for the attempted theft, and submit to regular check-ins with a probation officer, or face criminal charges that could result in 3 years in state prison. Glenn chose the first option, but you could see in his eyes that he was calculating, probably already planning how to get around the restrictions. The damage was done anyway. Carol finally saw what I'd been seeing for months. Her son hadn't been protecting her, had been positioning himself to rob her blind. The ride home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Carol cried for about half the distance, then got quiet, then got angry. Not at me, but at herself. "Harold, I'm sorry, I didn't see it sooner," she said as we pulled into our driveway, "and I'm sorry you felt like you had to hide your assets from us." "I was hiding them from you," I said, turning off the engine. "I was protecting them from him. There's a difference." We sat in the car for a few minutes, watching the neighbors across the street washing their car, normal people doing normal things on a Tuesday afternoon. "How long have you known," she asked, "about Glenn's intentions? Since the wedding reception, about the actual theft attempts, since you got that call from the bank. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me. You had to see it for yourself, had to have proof that couldn't be explained away or excused." She nodded slowly. "You're right. I would have made excuses for him. I have been making excuses for him his whole life." We went inside and Carol immediately started making changes. She called the bank and changed all her passwords, moved her accounts to a completely different institution, and set up additional security protocols. She told Glenn he had 30 days to find his own place to live, that the free ride was over. That was 8 months ago. Glenn moved in with a friend, got a job at Home Depot, and started the financial counseling program. He pays Carol $300 a month in restitution, which isn't much, but it's something. More importantly, he's stopped asking about money, stopped visiting unless invited, and treats our marriage with something that resembles respect. Carol and I are stronger now than we were before this whole thing started. She understands why I kept my real estate portfolio private initially, and she's actually helped me reorganize some of the properties for better tax efficiency. We've updated our wills properly, with ironclad protections for both our children and clear instructions that can't be contested or manipulated. I still own those 8 rental properties. They're actually worth closer to $9 million now with the market appreciation. The monthly income still pays for our comfortable retirement, covers our travel expenses, and lets us help Carol's school buy supplies for underprivileged kids. But now Carol knows, and I know she's not with me for the money. She was hurt when she found out about the properties, but she was more hurt by her son's betrayal than my secrecy. Glenn knows now too, but it doesn't matter anymore. He can't manipulate what he can't access, and he can't access what's legally protected by trusts and restraining orders. If you're remarrying later in life, here's what I learned. First, keep your major assets separate until you're absolutely sure about your partner's motivations and their family's motivations. Not because you don't trust them, but because money makes people crazy and you need to protect what you've built. Second, pay attention to red flags. When someone starts asking detailed questions about your finances, especially someone who should have no business knowing, they're not being helpful. They're being predatory. Third, document everything if you suspect financial manipulation. Get evidence before confronting anyone, because accusations without proof just create family drama. Most importantly, protect what you've built. I spent 35 years acquiring those properties through military discipline, construction management income, and smart investing. I weathered market crashes, difficult tenants, major repairs, and changing neighborhoods. I earned that security through work and sacrifice and careful planning, and ill be damned if ill let anyone, even family, threaten it through manipulation and fraud. Some secrets aren't lies. Sometimes privacy is just protection, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'm Harold Mitchell, I'm 57 years old. I own $9 million worth of rental properties in San Diego. My wife knows now. Her son knows too, and he learned the hard way that greed has consequences, and that some people are smarter than they look. Sometimes the people closest to you are the biggest threat to what you've worked your whole life to build. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if everyone else calls it family. Real wealth isn't just about having money. It's about having the wisdom to protect it from those who think they deserve it more than you do.